appreciate being asked to do this. Are all of you organ types? Is that what you are? Is that what you are? Are you the organ class? Are there people who aren't the organ class? Or is there anybody else? Oh, no, you're not?
No.
Okay. It's okay. The reason I ask is that when I speak about Reger, there's always two ways to do it. One way is you can concentrate on the organ music and the Reger and the organ and Reger as an organist and all that. Or you can go the other direction and talk about him in a much, much wider way as a composer, which corresponds more to the reality of him as a composer. And I've chosen here to do the latter of those two things. So organ music and organ things do come up here, but they only come up within the context of a lot of other things. And I think this is good. I think it's good particularly for organists to see the larger context in which this composer sits. He was, not a practiced organist himself. He composed for the organ, but it was not the genre, it was not the instrument with which he was most comfortable, ever. And he did that for certain reasons, external reasons, which are interesting and very sort of happenstance kind of reasons. And it's good that he did. But really, Reger's area that he really is, in my opinion, he really shines as a composer is chamber music. It's fantastic, actually. Also music for the orchestra. So here, let's listen to a little something, and before we start, this is a little excerpt. Hopefully it'll come up. Music.
Like Bach?
Yeah, it's very Wagnerian. Very Wagnerian. Other things? It also has some Debussy in it. This is the Romantic Suite of Reger from 1912, opus 125. There's three movements for orchestra. This is the second movement called Nocturne, which he said he composed while he was, he always said he composed it on the train. When he took night trains, he often took night trains because it's such a hectic schedule, and he would ride home through the Thuringian forest at nighttime, and this music kind of evokes the night of the Thuringian forest. If you've ever been through there at nighttime, it really does evoke that. I just wanted you to hear that just as a kind of prelude. If I do this, I bet I can get it. Oh yeah, that's good. Good. Now just go. Yeah, exactly. Good. The picturesque German town of Hildburghausen, there, sits just south of the Thuringian forest, about 80 kilometers southeast of Erfurt, 120 kilometers north of Nuremberg. Small town. In 1913, as Europe approached the precipice of the Great War, this out-of-the-way community of about 7,000 residents belonged to the Duchy of Saxony-Meiningen, with its long-reigning and arts-loving Duke Georg II. On the chilly afternoon of Sunday, the 7th of December, 1913, the 55 musicians of the Meiningen Court Orchestra, photographed here in that year, arrived at the Hildburghausen train station, prepared to offer one of its regular subscription concerts at the local civic theater. I should say that this photograph is the foyer of the Meiningen Theater, which is still there. It still exists now. You can go see that, and that foyer is where the orchestra regularly rehearsed. So this picture was at, sort of one of their regular moments, and you can see Reger up there. He's sitting there in the middle of those guys. Accompanying the ensemble that day in Hildburghausen was the Australian prodigy violinist Alma Moody, aged 13 at the time, and the featured soloist in the Brahms Violin Concerto, Opus 77. You may, or violinists will know who Alma Moody is a big deal violinist, but she was also a child prodigy, and she played with Meiningen when she was in her teens. Leading this entire traveling instrumentarium was the distinguished Meiningen Kapellmeister Max Reger, who almost exactly 2 years earlier had moved to Meiningen from Leipzig to assume the position, thus joining an illustrious line of conductors in service to Duke Georg that had included Hans von Bülow, Richard Strauss, and Fritz Steinbach. Reger, as the conductor of this orchestra, only superficially resembled his celebrated predecessors, however. Like Strauss, who had led the orchestra briefly between 1885 and 1886, he was a composer of renown. Like Bülow and Steinbach, he was deeply invested in the Beethoven to Brahms tradition, so central to the Duke of Meiningen's humanist vision. In the 2 years since acceding to the post, and just at the time of this photograph, Reger had almost single-handedly reasserted the Meiningen Orchestra as a first-rate touring ensemble. He was 40 years old here, and at the top of his game as a respected, if controversial, creative voice on the front lines of contemporary music. But if one were to examine more closely that December afternoon in Hildburghausen, as the train bearing this orchestra pulled into the station, one would encounter a more undomesticated, more unvarnished, even bizarre scene than is suggested by the antiseptic bullet points in Max Reger's curriculum vitae. Antoine Élisée Cherbulier, a cellist in the orchestra and Reger's pupil, recalled the episode about 8 years later. In the early afternoon, we all traveled to the small Saxony-Meiningen town of Hildburghausen. An irrepressible merriment overcame us. An impish exuberance possessed Reger. Before we disembarked, he put on Alma's juvenile hat. You remember this kid who's 13, the violinist, she has a little hat, and he takes it off of her. Its elastic band stretched under his opulent chin. The resulting picture was hilarious, but we became anxious when Reger suddenly announced that he would continue to wear Alma's hat while making his way through the town to the theater, the site of the concert, and about a 15-minute walk. Attempts to convince him otherwise were to no avail. I will never forget the walk to the theater as an example of Hans Sachs-like Mardi Gras comedy, as the quintessence of the struggle between artistic high-spiritedness and Philistine bafflement. At the head of the procession strode Master Reger, proud, upright, straight-faced, wearing a heavy fur coat, the little girl's hat mounted on his mighty head. Behind him came his inner circle, with Alma deprived of headdress. The end of the parade consisted of the gentlemen of the Hofkapelle, who could barely suppress their laughter insofar as they grasped the mad harmlessness of their leader. But among them were likewise some who had too great a respect for the Hofrat and professor atmosphere not to be appalled inwardly by this childishness. Of course, all of Hildburghausen awaited the famed Meiningen guests. The people stood along the streets. Curious eyes peered from behind curtains. Everyone saw Reger's impossible headgear, but no one dared cast serious doubt on its rectitude. Boundless bewilderment and deepest respect for the venerated German master united in the facial expressions of the upright Hildburghausen citizenry as a synthesis of compelling inner comedy, the outer symbol of which appeared as the expression of a not exactly ideal intellectuality. Reger, it's a good sentence, by the way. It's hard to translate these German sentences. They go on like that, they just do it. Reger is a stalwart figure in the organist's canon. For some, a counterbalance to Charles-Marie Widor and Alexandre Guillemot in France. For others, the end station in a line of German organ composers winding its way from Buxtehude and Bach over Mendelssohn and Rheinberger. For still others, and particularly in the English-speaking orbit, he is the overzealous vendor of preposterous organ music, producing unfathomable lava flows of post-Wagnerian chromaticism, not worth learning, not worth hearing, the jumping off point for nothing more than the saccharine kitsch of a Siegfried Karg-Elert on the one hand, and the reactionary dead-end counterpoint of a Hugo Diesler on the other. The organist and distinguished editor of the Musical Times of about a century ago, Harvey Grace, did not hesitate to air his exasperation in the desperate months before the end of the Great War. In the, quote, megalomania shown in modern German organ music, writes Grace, especially in that of Reger and the later examples of Karg-Elert, we see unmistakable signs of the frantic egoism and overemphasis that are the ultimate cause of the present war. Grace could only regard this musical language as overheated and uncivilized, a musical analog of the German army's march through Belgium in August 1914. Such sentiments have not been limited to organists. Indeed, the more far-flung vituperations against Reger's music have supplied much material for a history of musical invective generally. Much essentially dismissive commentary issues not only from this or that musical journalist, but also, as with Harvey Grace, from the most sophisticated musical minds of the last century, academics, performers, and informed listeners. Permit me a short parade of examples. In his study of the relationship between musical structure and expression, Karl Dahlhaus cannot help, musicologist Dahlhaus, cannot help but point out the thin line, quote, between rhetoric and pedantry in Reger, and the temptation to describe his music as kitsch is sometimes irresistible. Gerald Abraham, critic, while acknowledging some influence of Reger on Schoenberg and Berg, is compelled in the end to write him off as, quote, that unhappy might have been. Glenn Gould, pianist, comments with evident frustration on the conventional cadences scotch tape onto the end of wandering musical discourses that, in his view, do not justify them. And the very adept composer and writer, English, Alexander Grant Smith, vividly compares the composer's overwrought scores to, quote, the little girl who was told to look after her baby brother and to keep him well wrapped up. True to her trust, this good little girl covered up every visible part of her baby brother until the baby was breathless and herself brotherless. Even so did Max Reger nurse his music into the grave, thereby proving the truth of the adage, care killed the cat. Whenever he saw a crack in his counterpoint, he stuffed it up with 2 or 3 demi-semiquavers. Had a chord only 4 notes, he added 2 more. Did a melody move in a single line, he instantly doubled it. Thus he stifled his ideas with too many notes, just as some ostentatious and probably shoddy jewelers crowd their windows with gold watches, silver watches, diamond rings, and pearl necklaces until we are bewildered into apathy. In our own time, the German composer Wolfgang Riem, who is currently, I should say, the president of the International Max Reger Society, echoed that sentiment when he remarked adroitly that Reger's music is like a room with too much furniture in it. All of this, and much more, seems to confirm Arnold Schoenberg's often cited observation from 1922. In my opinion, Schoenberg wrote to Alexander Zemlinsky in 22, Reger must be performed often. 1, because he has written a lot. 2, because he is already dead, and we still do not have clarity about him. I consider him a genius. More than 90 years later, that remark continues to ring true. We are, in fact, not clear about Max Reger, how to listen to him, how to understand structure and process in his music, or even that structure and process in his music is worth understanding, how to evaluate his contribution to the historical narrative, how to speak about the vexing relationship between his supersized personality, his thinking, and his music. In one sense, this lack of clarity amounts to an extraordinary state of affairs, since we in fact do know a great deal about Reger. During his relatively short life, he managed not only to produce mountains of music, 146 opus numbers and much more besides, but also virtually to hemorrhage words. In countless letters and cards and several essays, this composer holds forth on topics ranging from the untapped possibilities of enharmonic modulation to the tone deafness of his critics, progress on one of his pieces or another, and his preference in cigars. From an inner circle of students, we know of his teaching methods. From reams of reviews, literally reams and reams and reams of reviews of his performances, and from meticulously annotated conducting scores, we know a good deal about his aesthetic tendencies and performance practices. We know how he played as a pianist. We know of his serious struggles with anxiety and alcohol, his addiction to round-the-clock work, his proclivity for off-color humor in strings of jokes that could force surrender from even today's most seasoned and edgy stand-up comics. We know how this child of Bismarck's German Empire thought of himself in the sweep of history, particularly German history, and how his historicist attitudes translate into an idiosyncratic musical language. And yet, who is Max Reger? Who is this unlikely, corpulent, 40-year-old Kapellmeister who would dare lead one of the most respected orchestras of the period, bearing the imprimatur of the German nobility, down the street of Hildburghausen, clad in a ridiculously undersized child's hat? This is the revered artist behaving badly, reminding of King David dancing naked in the streets in 2 Samuel. Certainly one way to answer the question of identity is through the record of portraiture, art, and caricature. Early photographs, here the 17-year-old Reger at the beginning of his study with theorist Hugo Riemann, have in common with later ones here in 1912. A certain defiant gaze, a thing that the Germans call Trotz, an all-be-damned seriousness of purpose wielded against the opposition. Reger's countenance is that of the libertarian artist who self-consciously stakes out his own path on his own terms. He does not project sympathy, but rather determination, isolation, and anxiety. One may perceive the same qualities in the last known photograph, taken in the month before the composer's death,